Hey guys, today I will be updating you guys on the state of the 2022 gubernatorial elections. We're just 5 months away from the election in November, and I think that the governor elections are the most interesting ones that we have this year. I think they're more interesting than the Senate was just because of how fluid states are in terms of which party they vote for on the gubernatorial level. So looking at the 2018 results, this was the last time governors were elected. Governors are typically elected every 4 years, and they typically fall in the midterm years. So we have most states that have elections this year, just like they did in 2018. The only exception is Vermont and New Hampshire. Their governors are elected every 2 years. So Phil Scott of Vermont and Chris Sununu of New Hampshire were both re-elected in 2020, both by margins of over 30%. And yes, they are Republicans in Vermont and New Hampshire. So looking at the 2018 map here, the Democrats did relatively well. They were able to win 23 seats and flip a total of 7. The Republicans, of course, were only able to flip Alaska. This was one race that was previously held by independent Bill Walker, who did not really run for re-election. He is on the ballot, but his campaign really did not last until the end. He was merely on the ballot. So looking at the 2014 election, this is what will explain why the Democrats did so well in 2018. In 2014, the Democratic Party had 18 governorships after the election. This was a horrible result. Only California was solid with Jerry Brown. The only state that voted for the Democrats by over 15% was California. New York was a margin of 13.9 for Andrew Cuomo. And so the map in 2014 was horrible. This was after 6 years of Barack Obama. The 2014 midterm cycle as a whole was just devastating for the Democratic Party. But if you look at the 2018 races, they were able to pick up many of the races that they had lost 4 years prior. And of course, they now have 22 because the Democrats lost Virginia. So they went from 23 down to 22 after Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe late last year. So looking at the 2022 gubernatorial map, I'm going to start off by filling in the solid states. Of course, these are ones that are going to vote for either party by margins of over 15%, and essentially just races that either party is guaranteed to win. Maryland as well as Massachusetts currently do have Republican incumbents, Larry Hogan in Maryland and Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. However, they are both not going to run because they are both term limited. They cannot run for a third consecutive term. They were both first elected in 2014, of course, with that wave of Republican support. Larry Hogan 3.8%, Charlie Baker 1.9%, but because of their popularity in their states, they were able to defeat their Democratic challengers in 2018, but in 2022, things will be a little bit different. They will not be running for re-election. There are no major Republicans that are able to challenge the Democratic Party in these two states. Remember, these two states voted for Joe Biden, 25% in Maryland, 33% in Massachusetts. Democrats are 100% going to be able to flip these two states back, while on the Republican side, we have many solid states in the middle of the country, as well as most of the southern states. And this is what I mean about the governorships being a lot more interesting. You have Republicans in Vermont and New Hampshire, Vermont, which voted for Joe Biden by almost 40%, and you also had a Republican in 2018 in Massachusetts. So I think that these gubernatorial elections are a lot more interesting to look at. So this gives the Republicans 19, the Democrats 12, with their solid states filled in. And so now I'm going to move on and take a look at the likely races that we have. And so looking at this forecast here, this is the Politico forecast for 2022. It is very early, so there really is no data on this, but this is a good picture of how these races are. The Republicans do have a lot more solid states. There are a lot more races that the Republicans hold, a lot more governorships that the Republicans hold that they are almost guaranteed to win. The Democrats do have a lot more vulnerabilities. However, I don't think they're really going to necessarily lose any or most of these lean Democratic states. Now, in the toss-up category here, there are 5. I personally believe that there are 8 that we really have to look closely at. But looking at these 5 toss-up races, Arizona and Georgia have Republican incumbents. Brian Kemp in Georgia, Doug Ducey in Arizona, who is term limited, while Democrats are in Nevada with Steve Sisolak, Wisconsin with Tony Evers, and in Kansas with Laura Kelly, who is especially vulnerable Democrat in Kansas, so that's pretty obvious. So looking at these 5 toss-up races, the Democratic Party, I think, does actually have there's a very high possibility the Democratic Party actually does well in them. These are states that Democrats have typically done well in, and they won 4 out of these 5 in the 2020 presidential election. The only exception is, of course, Kansas. So looking at the likely states on this map, starting off Oregon for the Democratic Party, Kate Brown was not a strong candidate in both 2014 and 2018. She is not going to be able to run for re-election for a third term. I think that's good for the Democratic Party, honestly. And this race will obviously remain in Democratic hands. It is still the state of Oregon. Jared Polis in Colorado and Michelle Lujan Grisham, I think they're both going to do relatively well in their races, although the margins are not going to be solid. Tim Walz in Minnesota, he is poised to win his re-election, as well as Ned Lamont in the state of Connecticut. And in Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo won in 2018. She went on to become Biden's Commerce Secretary. So we do have the lieutenant governor as the current governor who is running for re-election there. He will end up winning this race. So with the likely states filled in for the Democrats, they end up with 18 governorships. For the Republicans now, who already have more with just their solid ones, I have first the state of Alaska. I think that Mike Dunleavy is going to win his re-election against Bill Walker. Bill Walker, of course, the former governor, elected in 2014. Did not really run for re-election in 2018, but in 2022, even though he's running again, the state of Alaska is very likely to end up voting Republican again. In the state of Texas, Greg Abbott is most likely going to defeat Beto O'Rourke. I think that his publicity stunt with the shooting, with that press conference, what Beto O'Rourke did, I don't think that's really going to help him too much, especially in a state that does not really vote Democratic at all. But I think that Texas is going to still be a race to watch. Beto O'Rourke is still a major candidate, still a very well-known candidate, and I think that he will still make the race relatively competitive, considering that the state is Texas and we are in a year in which Joe Biden has an approval rating of 41%. Moving on to the state of Florida, I think that Ron DeSantis will also have a pretty easy pathway to his re-election. In 2018, he actually had the closest gubernatorial race. If you look back at 2018, Ron DeSantis won by 0.39%. This was the only race decided by a margin of less than 1% against Andrew Gillum. But in 2022, Ron DeSantis is relatively popular, very well known nationwide. He is the second place frontrunner currently for the GOP nomination for president in 2024. So Ron DeSantis, I don't see him losing. I also have the state of Iowa with Kim Reynolds and Ohio with Mike DeWine running for their re-elections. They are poised to win their races as well at this point. They are not really going to face too tough of Democratic challenges. So this will give the Republicans 24 seats and the Democrats 18. I say seats and governorships interchangeably, but basically the Republicans start off with an advantage. So now we have these 8 toss-up races. These are the ones that are really going to decide which party holds more governorships after these midterm elections. Now, before I take a look at those, make sure you join my Discord server if you have not, the link to which is at the very top of the description below, where you can stay updated on all of the 2022 elections, as well as the 2024 presidential election. So looking at the 8 toss-up races, we have Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maine, and Georgia. So I'm going to fill them in based on which states currently have incumbents there. So in Nevada, we, of course, have Democrats, while in the entirety of the upper Rust Belt, we do have Democratic incumbents. We have a Democratic incumbent in Maine, and on the Republican side, they only have Arizona and Georgia, while currently Kansas is also held by a Democrat. So looking at these races, of course, Democrats have a lot more to defend, so they start off at a disadvantage. And I mean, the races in Arizona and Georgia, I think, are not going to be especially close in Georgia, but Arizona, I think, will be a lot more interesting. Kansas really is the most vulnerable Democrat. And Wisconsin, with Tony Evers, he is also relatively in a very competitive race. So really, the only states without incumbents running for re-elections are Pennsylvania with Bob Casey and Arizona, or not Bob Casey, with Tom Wolf, and Arizona with Doug Ducey. So these are the 2 races in which incumbents are not running for their re-election. These are the open races, while these other 6, you do have incumbents, 5 Democratic incumbents, 1 Republican incumbent running for their re-election. So I'm going to start off with the state of Michigan. I think this one is the least competitive out of the 8. In the state of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer is running for her re-election, and of course, this is a race in which basically the entire Republican field was disqualified. Every single major candidate was kicked out of the race. James Craig, the frontrunner for the entirety of the campaign, was kicked out because he did not get enough valid signatures to appear on the ballot. The court in the state is not really going to side with them, although sometimes they will do that in terms of putting candidates on ballots, even though they did not meet the specific requirements or deadlines. But on the Republican side, Ryan Kelly seems to be the new frontrunner. Before this, he was polling at 5%, 7% was his highest. Now he's at 19% because, of course, James Craig, Mike Brown, and Perry Johnson were all kicked out of being able to appear on the ballot in November. So they basically lost the nomination. James Craig may run an independent or a write-in campaign, but that's really not really going to materialize into too much. They're still going to vote for the Republican nominee. So if you look at Gretchen Whitmer's polling numbers against any number of these Republicans, you'll see that she absolutely destroys them because these are relatively unknown candidates, as they were previously polling in the single digits. Even against James Craig, though, Gretchen Whitmer previously was polling relatively strong. She was leading in most of the polls that were released, an overwhelming majority of the polls that were released. So Gretchen Whitmer is in a good position for her re-election. Of course, in 2018, she was first elected with a margin of 9.6%. I think that margin is going to go down. She was one of the most unpopular governors during the pandemic, and I think that she is not going to be able to get almost 10% of a margin over her Republican challenger this time around. The next state I want to take a look at is the state of Georgia. This is another very interesting race. Brian Kemp versus Stacey Abrams, a rematch of 2018, in which Kemp won 50.2% of the vote, barely avoiding that, or there was really no runoff, but he barely won that majority. In 2022, it will be a little bit different. The Republicans have a better advantage going into this race. Brian Kemp has led in every single poll that has been released by margins of around 5 to 6%. The RCP average is 5.2 in favor of Kemp. And of course, I mean, in a year where the generic congressional ballot looks like this is the first time Republicans led since 2016. And after 8 years of Barack Obama, it will be very difficult for the Democratic Party to end up winning in Georgia. I think that Stacey Abrams is the best possible candidate. There's no doubt about that the Democrats could put up. But this is still a race that, even though Joe Biden and Democrats did very well here, Trump still did win this state by 5% in 2016. And this is still a state that has a very long Republican voting history. And so even though Democrats control both Senate seats currently with Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, I think that 2022, on the gubernatorial level at least, it will be very difficult. If you look back, the state of Georgia has a relatively long history of voting for Republican governors. The last Democratic governor was Roy Barnes, who was elected in 1998, or reelected in first elected in 1998, and he would go on to lose in 2022 to Sonny Perdue, who is the cousin of David Perdue, who lost to Kemp in that primary, as well as losing to Jon Ossoff earlier last year. So Georgia, I have this state currently as being lean for the Republicans. I think they have a clear advantage in this race, and I think that no matter what Stacey Abrams does, she is going to struggle, even though I think that she can definitely put up a pretty strong fight against the incumbent Republican. The next thing I want to look at is the state of Pennsylvania. This is a race in which 4 years prior, the Democratic Party won by a solid margin of almost 17%, almost 18%. Tom Wolf, with John Fetterman as his running mate, defeated Scott Wagner and Jeff Bardos. So in 2022, Josh Shapiro is the Democratic nominee. Doug Mastriano is the Republican one. We just had the primary here a couple of days ago. And Doug Mastriano is probably the worst candidate that the Republican Party could have nominated. He is on the far right. Trump did endorse him very, very late in the campaign, and I think that he is going to lose to Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro appeals much better to independents. There are no polls released for this race, but you can see right after that primary for the Republicans, right after Mastriano was nominated and it looked like he was going to win, basically all of these sources put their rankings as more in favor for the Democrats, and I think that is very characteristic of this race. The Democratic Party now has the clear advantage in Pennsylvania just because of how bad of a candidate Mastriano is, and so that is why currently the state of Pennsylvania I have as lean for the Democrats. And so next up on the list is the state of Maine. This race is surprisingly close because we have two governors running against each other. Janet Mills as the presumptive Democratic nominee, Paul LePage as the presumptive Republican nominee. So in 2018, Janet Mills was elected. 2014, Paul LePage was reelected. And in the state of Maine, you cannot run for a third consecutive term, but you can run for a third non-consecutive term. So Paul LePage is running for a third term after not running last time, so that allows him to run because he just cannot serve serve 3 terms in a row, but he can if they are not connected. So looking at the polling between these two presumptive nominees, Janet Mills is leading in the polls. This is a state that favors the Democratic Party, and Janet Mills is the incumbent, so she will have the incumbency on her side. So I do think that the Democratic Party does have the slight advantage here in Maine, even though the national environment is not going to favor them. I think that Janet Mills has a relatively strong chance still of coming out on top. And so now we have the 4 final races: Wisconsin, Kansas, Arizona, and Nevada. And these really are the 4 closest races. Starting off with Kansas, this is one in which the Democrats currently hold Laura Kelly as the incumbent Democrat in the governor's mansion. She is probably going to lose. Derek Schmidt as the presumptive Republican. So in 2018, Laura Kelly defeated the very unpopular Chris Kobach, who was on the far right as well, like we saw with Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania that we'll see this year. But Laura Kelly is now polling behind Derek Schmidt. All the latest polls suggest that she is probably going to lose, although there's really only one, but it is still Kansas. It has a very long history of voting for Republicans, although on the gubernatorial level, that really is not necessarily the case. They have voted for Democratic governors quite a bit. But Derek Schmidt, I do think, is going to end up winning this race. Laura Kelly, just as a Democrat in a year that is so hostile to them, I think that she is going to be very vulnerable. And so that is why I'm going to categorize Kansas as being lean for the Republican Party. And the next state I have is Nevada, with a Democratic incumbent here in Steve Sisolak. Steve Sisolak, I think it will do better than Catherine Cortez Masto. I think that he is in a better position. So in 2018, of course, Sisolak was elected. He was elected to replace Brian Sandoval, who defeated Bob Goodman by a huge margin in 2014. Of course, that was after 6 years of Barack Obama in a horrible year for the Democratic Party. And he, of course, defeated Adam Laxalt last time, who is now running against Masto for the Senate seat. But in 2022, on the Republican side, currently the frontrunner is Joe Lombardo. And I think that he is going to end up winning this nomination. But if you do look at the polls between Lombardo and Sisolak, Steve Sisolak does lead in most of the polls that were released. The latest one does show him 9 points ahead, and I do think that Sisolak is in a good position for his race. He is still the incumbent, and incumbent governors are easier to get reelected than incumbent senators, as partisanship plays a lot smaller of a role. I do think that Steve Sisolak has a slight advantage here, so I'm going to categorize the state of Nevada as being lean for the Democrats. And we have our final 2 states. This is the only states really that I'm going to categorize as being tilt. I think that in all these other races, there are clear candidates that have the advantage, but in the state of Arizona, Doug Ducey will not be able to run for a 3rd term, so he is now term limited. So we have both a Republican and Democratic primary. On the Republican side, Kari Lake is the front runner. She is a little bit more to the far right as well, a little bit of a theme that we're seeing with many of these GOP nominees. Katie Hobbs is the Democratic Secretary of State. So right now, Katie Hobbs is polling better than Kari Lake, and not just because of the polling. She is just a better candidate just as a whole. And so I do think that she will end up on top in this race, although I do only give her a very slight advantage. I think that this race can definitely go both ways, but Kari Lake is just not a good candidate on the Republican side. And so that is why I think that Arizona, with the shifting trends favoring the Democrats, I will categorize it as being tilt for the Democrats. And finally, in the state of Wisconsin, I have this race as being tilt for the GOP, even though the incumbent is Democrat Tony Evers. It is 2022, 2 years after Joe Biden was elected, and the pattern here in Wisconsin dictates that the party that holds the White House loses the Wisconsin gubernatorial election. So that's unfortunate for Evers. If Trump was elected, I do think that Evers would have a much better chance, but it's not just because of the pattern. Rebecca Kleefisch is the former lieutenant governor. She is expected to win, or was expected to win, for a majority of the race. Now, Tim Mitchells is polling ahead of her by 1% according to that latest poll, so we'll see what happens there. But just looking at the numbers here, Tony Evers is not polling that well. These polls are from August of last year, when, of course, Joe Biden's numbers were still okay. They were still in the positives in August of last year. So the situation has definitely changed significantly, and I think that Tony Evers is in a very vulnerable position. I think that second to Laura Kelly, Tony Evers is the second most vulnerable Democrat at this point that's running for their re-election. So I'm going to categorize Wisconsin as being tilt for the GOP, and so I have 27 for the Republicans, 23 for the Democrats. So this will be a net gain of 1 for the Democratic Party, as they're able to win both Maryland and Massachusetts Massachusetts, as well as flipping Arizona, but they will lose, according to this at least, Wisconsin and Kansas. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which races you're watching. Join my Discord server if you haven't, link at the top of the description below. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't, and again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.